On a cold March morning in 1964, 9-year-old Marise Chiverella left her home in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, carrying books for school and a can of soup for her teacher. She never made it to class. Hours later, her body was discovered in a frozen strip mine, the victim of a brutal crime that shocked the community and left investigators desperate for answers. For nearly 6 decades, her case remained unsolved, until modern science and forensic genealogy uncovered the name of a killer no one expected. Hazleton in the 1960s was a quiet coal town, a place where neighbors knew one another and doors were left unlocked at night. In this close-knit community lived 9-year-old Marise Chiverella. The youngest in a large Italian-American family, Marise was the kind of child who radiated warmth wherever she went. For the Chiverella family, life was simple but rich in love. Sunday mornings meant church, followed by family dinners that brought everyone together around the table. Faith and discipline guided their household, but so did laughter and affection. In every sense, Maurice was a child of innocence, sheltered by her family and community, secure in the rhythms of small-town life. But on March 18th, 1964, that sense of security would be shattered. That morning, she left home earlier than usual, her tiny frame making its way down the familiar streets. For those who saw her, she was just another child on her way to class, innocent and unassuming. No one could have guessed that this would be the last time Maurice would be seen alive by those who loved her. The details of what happened next chilled Hazleton for decades. Maurice never made it to school. By midday, when her absence became noticed, worry spread quickly. Teachers assumed she might be late, while her family expected to see her come home for lunch. When neither happened, the fear set in. Searches began, first by family and neighbors, then by police. Streets that once felt safe became ominous, every shadow holding the weight of possibility. The community mobilized, combing through fields, abandoned lots, and quiet corners of town. What they were looking for, a little girl with bright eyes and boundless promise, was unimaginable to lose. As night fell over Hazleton, the search for 9-year-old Marise Chiverella grew more frantic. Parents, neighbors, and police scoured the streets, flashlights sweeping over fields and alleyways, calling her name into the cold spring air. The town that had always felt so safe now seemed full of shadows. By the next morning, the grim truth was uncovered. In an abandoned coal strip area on the outskirts of town, Marissa's body was found. The discovery sent a chill through Hazleton that no season could explain. The small girl who had set out for school with books in hand was now lying lifeless in a desolate patch of land, her journey cut tragically short. The crime scene was a picture of horror. Investigators noted signs of violence. Maurice had been bound, assaulted, and strangled. Her clothing was disheveled, her belongings scattered, evidence of a desperate struggle against someone far stronger. For the officers first on scene, hardened by years of police work, the sight was almost unbearable. This was not an accident or a random misfortune. This was the deliberate destruction of a child's life. Detectives immediately began cataloging the scene. Footprints in the dirt, disturbed patches of earth, and every scrap of possible evidence were carefully marked. A school book lay nearby, a haunting reminder of the morning she set out with nothing but the eagerness of a child heading to class. Polaroids were taken, diagrams sketched, and statements prepared. But in 1964, the science of solving crimes was limited. Without modern DNA analysis, investigators relied on fingerprints, fibers, and sheer determination. When news of the discovery spread, the reaction was swift and devastating. Hazleton was a small, tight-knit community where families knew one another and children roamed freely. Now, fear replaced familiarity. Parents who once allowed their children to walk to school alone began escorting them, eyes scanning every corner with suspicion. Doors that had never known a lock were bolted shut. For the first time in living memory, Hazleton felt unsafe. The Chiverella family was struck with unimaginable grief. Their youngest child, the one known for her bright smile and endless curiosity, had been stolen from them in the most brutal way possible. Theirs was a heartbreak that rippled outward, felt by neighbors, classmates, teachers, and even strangers who could not fathom such cruelty. Police vowed to find the person responsible. Officers interviewed locals, tracked down tips, and scrutinized anyone who seemed out of place. Every suspicious glance, every inconsistent story became a potential lead. Yet beneath their determination lay a current of frustration. No matter how carefully they combed through the evidence, the answers remained elusive. Hazleton would never be the same. The discovery of Marise's body shattered the town's sense of innocence and safety. What was once an ordinary walk to school had become a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that evil could exist even in the quietest of places. And though the investigation pressed forward, the shadow of that morning lingered, heavy and unshakable, over everyone who called Hazleton home. Detectives launched a wide investigation, combing through leads, speaking to neighbors, and retracing Marise's final steps on that fateful morning. The first stage was interviews. Officers knocked on doors across Hazleton, questioning anyone who might have seen Marise on her walk to school. Some neighbors recalled catching a glimpse of her dark hair and small frame, hurrying along the familiar streets. Others spoke of strange cars seen idling in the area, or unfamiliar men who didn't belong. Every account was written down, compared and analyzed for patterns. Attention soon turned to possible suspects. Known troublemakers, drifters, and men with violent pasts were brought in for questioning. Rumors swirled about a suspicious figure who had been hanging around the schoolyard, about a stranger spotted near the abandoned coal strip land. Police also scrutinized locals who had reputations for drinking or aggression, men whose names already sat in their files. Each was interrogated, pressed for alibis, and sometimes even held overnight. But the truth was elusive. Without clear evidence, every suspect seemed to slip through the cracks. Some had strong alibis, others only circumstantial connections. Hazleton, once so small and safe, now seemed full of secrets, but none pointed clearly to the hand that had taken Marise's life. The limitations of the era's forensic science quickly became a painful obstacle. In 1964, there was no DNA testing, no computerized databases, no advanced profiling. Evidence collected at the scene, fibers, fluids, fingerprints, could only be analyzed in the most basic ways. Investigators preserved what they could, but the tools of the time could not unlock the truth hidden in those samples. Leads that today might have provided answers in hours instead turned into dead ends. Frustration grew among the investigators. They worked tirelessly, retracing interviews, following hunches, even revisiting suspects multiple times. The Pennsylvania State Police offered assistance, lending manpower and expertise. Still, weeks passed without an arrest. The weight of the case bore down heavily, not just on the officers but on the entire town. For Hazleton's community, the delay was agonizing. Parents lived in fear, unsure whether the killer was a stranger passing through or someone among them. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. The sense of trust and familiarity that had once defined the town dissolved into suspicion. Every face seemed dangerous, every stranger a possible predator. By the end of the year, the case had begun to stall. Despite the best efforts of investigators, no definitive suspect emerged. Files filled with interviews, evidence was cataloged, and reports were written, but progress slowed. What had started as a frantic, high-profile hunt gradually became a cold trail. The Chiverellas clung to faith in each other, but the pain was unrelenting. Holidays and birthdays passed with a lingering sense of absence. Each milestone, graduations, weddings, new children being born, was bittersweet, a reminder of what Marise herself would never experience. Her dreams of becoming a teacher, her bright curiosity, her boundless future, all had been silenced on that March morning. The family's grief became a quiet, constant companion, etched into their lives in ways that could never be erased. Meanwhile, police never fully abandoned the case. Over the years, detectives revisited the files, re-examining old evidence, chasing rumors, and hoping for breakthroughs. Tips surfaced from time to time. Someone claimed to have overheard a confession. Another swore they had seen something strange decades earlier. Each lead brought a flicker of hope, but more often than not, it dissolved into disappointment. Suspects were questioned, sometimes arrested, only to be cleared later. The lack of forensic tools in the 1960s meant the most crucial evidence remained locked away, useless until technology caught up. The case grew cold, but it never truly disappeared. For Hazleton, the murder of little Maurice became part of its collective memory, a scar on the town's identity. For decades, residents recalled the day innocence was lost. Parents told their children to be careful, to stay close, to never walk alone. Warnings rooted in the memory of a crime that had gone unpunished. Even those who had not lived in Hazleton in 1964 knew the story. It lingered in whispers at church gatherings, in conversations at grocery stores, in the way neighbors looked at strangers with suspicion. The abandoned coal strip land where Marissa's body was found stood as a grim reminder of what had happened. Detectives who had worked the case retired, some passing away without ever seeing it solved, yet always carrying the burden of unfinished justice. The town newspapers occasionally revived the story, marking anniversaries or reporting on new, possible breaks, but hope would rise only to crash again. For nearly 60 years, silence reigned. Maurice's memory lived on in her family's hearts, but justice remained out of reach. But everything changed by the late 20th century. Here, criminal investigations were undergoing a revolution. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA technology, offered new hope to victims' families who had long lived without answers. What once seemed impossible in the 1960s, unlocking the identity of a killer from a single trace of biological evidence, was now within reach. Across the country, decades-old cold cases were being reopened, files dusted off, and forgotten evidence re-examined under a new scientific light. For the family of Marise Chiverella, whose murder in 1964 had haunted Hazleton for decades, this scientific progress ignited cautious hope. The Pennsylvania State Police, still committed to solving one of the region's most notorious unsolved crimes, decided to revisit the evidence preserved from the crime scene. Investigators retrieved carefully stored samples, items collected by detectives who, though limited by the tools of their time, had known their importance. Those early officers could never have imagined a world where science might one day read secrets locked in a drop of blood or a strand of hair. In the early 2000s, forensic experts attempted to extract DNA from the evidence. It was a delicate process. The samples were nearly 4 decades old, degraded by time and storage conditions. Yet through meticulous testing, they succeeded. A partial DNA profile was developed, fragile but groundbreaking. For the first time since 1964, investigators had something tangible, a genetic fingerprint of Marissa's killer. The results were entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. Across the United States, thousands of samples were being uploaded, connecting criminals to crimes thought long forgotten. The hope was simple. Somewhere in the system, there might be a match. Detectives in the Chiverella family waited anxiously, believing the breakthrough was finally at hand. But the database returned no hits. The killer's DNA stood alone, unmatched to anyone already cataloged. It was a cruel twist. Science had given investigators the killer's genetic code, yet without a name to tie it to, the case remained unresolved. The profile confirmed what they already knew. Someone, somewhere, was responsible. But who? Still, the development was a turning point. It meant the investigation had moved forward in ways unimaginable decades earlier. The DNA profile became both a beacon of hope and a source of frustration. Investigators now carried a powerful piece of evidence, but the technology of the time could only take them so far. They had the shadow of a killer, but not his face. For the Chiverella family, the news was bittersweet. The science proved the case was not dead, yet justice still felt out of reach. Each passing year was another reminder of time lost, time Marise had been denied, time her family had spent waiting. Though the DNA profile did not yet deliver a name, it ensured that the case would never again be forgotten. The science of tomorrow had finally caught up to the crime of 1964, and investigators knew that if they held on long enough, the truth might one day emerge from those silent strands of genetic code. And then by the 2000s, using public genealogy sites, investigators could identify distant cousins of an unknown suspect and then work backward through generations of family history to narrow the pool. It was painstaking, almost like solving a puzzle that spanned decades. But for cases long considered unsolvable, it offered hope where none had existed. For the Pennsylvania State Police, still determined to bring justice for 9-year-old Marise Chiverella, forensic genealogy represented a final chance. In 2019, they sent the preserved DNA profile from the 1964 crime to experts trained in genetic genealogy. The results came back with something investigators had never seen before. Not a suspect's name, but a web of distant relatives who shared fragments of the killer's DNA. The task then shifted to building family trees. Genealogists combed through census records, obituaries, marriage certificates, and birth records, meticulously piecing together connections between these relatives. Each clue was a branch, each branch a step closer to the unknown man whose DNA had been left at the scene of Marise's murder decades earlier. Dozens of family lines were explored, with investigators patiently ruling out one possibility after another. Slowly, the picture began to sharpen. A particular family tree led back to Hazleton, Pennsylvania, the very place where the crime had occurred. Among the names, one stood out: James Paul Forte. Forte was not a stranger to Hazleton. Born in the community, he had lived there during the 1960s and was in his early 20s when Marise was killed. As genealogists traced the connections and cross-referenced records, Forte emerged as the strongest candidate. What shocked investigators most was not only his genetic connection, but his past. Forte had a troubling criminal record, including charges of indecent exposure and assault. Though he had never been convicted of a crime as brutal as murder, his history suggested a man with dangerous tendencies. He had died in 1980, never facing justice for what he had done. To confirm their suspicions, police obtained a DNA sample from Forte's remains. The analysis was conclusive. His genetic profile was a perfect match to the DNA recovered from Marise's body in 1964. After nearly 60 years, the identity of the man who had stolen her life was finally known. The revelation was both relieving and devastating. For the Chiverella family, the name James Forte meant their decades of waiting were over. But it also meant that justice in a courtroom would never come. He had escaped punishment in life, and only through science had his guilt been revealed. For Hazleton, the breakthrough was historic. It proved that time and silence could not bury the truth. Through the power of forensic genealogy, the voice of a 9-year-old girl lost in 1964 was finally heard, and her story was no longer one of mystery, but of resolution. For Marise's surviving siblings, the confirmation reopened old wounds. They were children themselves when she was taken, and they had grown up under the shadow of her absence. Now, as adults, they faced the painful reality that the man who destroyed their sister's life had lived and died without ever being held accountable. Fort had gone to his grave in 1980, his secret intact, escaping the courtroom justice he so richly deserved. Yet alongside the grief was a quiet sense of relief. The family finally knew the truth. They could speak Marise's name without the burden of uncertainty, without wondering who might still be walking free. In interviews, they expressed gratitude to the investigators who had refused to give up, and to the advances in forensic genealogy that had made the breakthrough possible. Marise's oldest brother described the moment as a final piece to the puzzle, even though it could never bring her back. The closure was bittersweet. There'd be no trial, no chance to face Ford and demand answers. No judge could sentence him, no jury could condemn him. Justice, in the traditional sense, had come too late. But truth itself became a form of justice, delayed but not denied. The Chiverellas took comfort in knowing that their sister's story would not end as an unsolved mystery, but as a testament to perseverance, science, and faith. For Hazleton, the resolution was historic. The case that had haunted the community for nearly 60 years was no longer a shadow without a name. As Marise's family reflected on her memory, they chose not to focus solely on the violence of her death, but on the light of her short life, the little girl who loved school, who dreamed of teaching, who carried a bright smile into every room. Justice had come too late, but her story, finally complete, ensured she would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a child whose innocence would never be forgotten.